with the U.S. sanctions on their trading partners, EU leaders are pushing for greater economic sovereignty and a potential new financial system. But not everyone is on board. Can it work? And tragedy has struck China's largest ride-hailing company again. How is Didi dealing with its second murder case in a matter of months? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. European Union leaders are taking a stand against the U.S. sanctions on the EU's trading partners. German and French leaders said they are working on ways to sidestep U.S. sanctions, including a possible role for central banks and an independent financing tool. The discussions come after the U.S. released a tidal wave of aggressive sanctions-related and tariff policies this year on Russia, China, Turkey and Iran. Now, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas urged Europe on Monday to react and strengthen Europe's autonomy and sovereignty in trade, economic and finance policy. At a separate meeting on Monday, French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire said, with Germany, we are determined to work on an independent European or Franco-German financing tool, which would allow us to avoid being the collateral victims of U.S. extraterrestrial sanctions. I want Europe to be a sovereign continent, not a vassal. Vassal means, by the way, a person or a country in a subordinate position to others. So what would a new financial system look like if it becomes a possible reality? Could it salvage the EU's business interests with its trading partners under US sanctions? And how are European leaders coping with their new rank in Trump's America First agenda? Joining me for the discussion from New Jersey in the US is Professor Tim Buthe, Vice Dean and Chair of International Relations in the School of Governance at the Technical University of Munich, and in Paris, Professor Douglas Yates, Professor of Politics at the American Graduate School in Paris. Welcome, gentlemen, to all of you. Professor Buthe, let me go to you first.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Now, we want to know what would be the scale of damage, as we were hearing the European leader talking about collateral damage to Europe when it comes to dealing with its trading partners. We know, for instance, among EU member states, Germany was the largest trading partner with Turkey, and Turkey was the fifth largest partner of EU exports of goods in 2017. In terms of Russia, in 2017, Russia was the fourth largest partner of EU in terms of imports and the third largest partner for EU exports of goods. China is the largest partner for EU imports of goods and second largest partner for EU export in 2017, and in 2017 EU imports from Iran increased by 84% and EU exports increased by almost 1/3. So very important trading relations we're talking about there. So how much damage, how much is the EU caught in the between when US is getting tough with the EU's trading partners? Professor Buthe.
Well, we're talking about billions of dollars vis-a-vis Iran alone, and there is, the direct economic cost in that regard that the EU is clearly concerned about and is trying to avoid. But I think there's also the larger issue that the Trump administration has pursued much more aggressively than previous administrations an extraterritorial application of its policies in ways that I think is creating a sense among European governments that they must push back to maintain both vis-a-vis their domestic audiences, but also on the international stage, a sense that they can make policy independently of the United States if necessary.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've been hearing the troubles that are puzzling, let's say, EU leaders in the run-up to the U.S.'s decision to reimpose sanctions on Iran. Professor Yates, how do you make of the timing? What do you think have driven European leaders to make these announcements this week? We know that on Monday, the same day, EU leaders voiced growing concern over the U.S.'s sanctions policy and vowed to set up an independent financial system. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani urged the the remaining signatories to the Iran deal to act and save the pact and to operate their programs more quickly and more transparently. Is that what has triggered the EU announcement on a new financial tool?
Yes, I think that many French corporations, for example, have already made the decision out of prudence to leave. For example, Total, the big French oil company, is stopping its investments in South Pars in Iran. But generally speaking, the removal of the sanctions regime was very beneficial. France was one of the principal beneficiaries of that. Europe needs Iranian oil. There's a lot of work to be done. So Iran has been regularly diplomatically moving towards Europe to get them to make a united front. But there's a longer history to this, because the sanctions regime of the United States has provoked nationalist sentiments in Europe. American law is extraterritorial. That is, it's the United States law that is being imposed on Europe. How does that work? It works through a system of interbank transfer called SWIFT.
Right.
SWIFT covers most of the money that moves around the world that makes globalization possible, something like 20,000 financial institutions. And the United States dollar is de facto the world currency for oil. Through those two tools, the United States has been able to impose its sanctions on Europe. And in order to liberate themselves, and prodded by Rouhani to keep the Iran deal alive, the Europeans are seeking a way to get around this. So I think that their meeting was discussing how to create a system where they could provide euros, not dollars, but euros, to pay for Iranian oil. That, of course, would disrupt the system that the United States has set in place since the 1970s.
Professor Buthe, let's talk a little bit more about this SWIFT system and the alternative that some European leaders have proposed. Do you think that is the way to go? Do you think that is possible? And does the EU have the infrastructure necessary to come up with a parallel system to the SWIFT in a time that is short enough to cushion some of the damage from US sanctions on Iran?
So there are really two systems that are being discussed. One is to use cryptocurrencies, these sort of artificial currencies based on very complicated algorithms to make them safe for Iran to conduct international financial transactions. There's all kinds of problems with that, but that's one of the options that Iran in particular has been pushing. There are, I think, great skepticism whether that can take care of the entire set of financial transactions vis-a-vis Western Europe. But then there is the option of basically setting up a parallel system that would work essentially like SWIFT, but not have financial transactions actually being routed through New York or any other U.S. governed financial center. And that's really what's giving the U.S. government sort of direct political and regulatory influence here over the SWIFT system, that practically all financial transactions that are going through the current SWIFT system either are routed through some part of the United States or are going through a system that is partially U.S. owned and therefore subject to U.S. jurisdiction. And the U.S. government is using that as a way to gain influence. So the idea would be to create a parallel system that does the same without U.S.
Yeah. What is the likelihood that this can be realized in anytime soon by European leaders?
Well, if we look at the effort that was made by China to create the cross-border interbank system, one of the difficulties of replacing SWIFT is that the dollar has become de facto the reserve currency of the world. That is, countries around the world have huge dollar reserves. In order to change the SWIFT system, you would have to find a substitute for the US dollar, and for the moment, the yuan is not able to play that role. Therefore, if you don't have a substitute, the United States has the ability, if they cut you out of SWIFT, to shut you off. The effect of sanctions against Iran was simply that SWIFT delisted Iran, and therefore Iran didn't have access to those dollar markets. So I do believe that, like the cross-border interbank system, Europe could issue euro credits, but if the United States was to retaliate, they would have to back down and stop that. A parallel system is technically feasible. There's nothing stopping it. But right now, there's a political battle to defend dollar hegemony. And you either have to sort of be on the team or be excluded from it. The effectiveness of the sanctions was being cut out of the US dollar market.
I see. Professor Buthe, what is your take on the feasibility of such a parallel system to the SWIFT system that is dominated by the United States? Of course, there's a very important message that's being sent by the Trump administration, right? If you don't listen to me, you're out of the system, you're out of business.
Yes, and it's the political feasibility. I think that's much more in question than the technical feasibility. Technically, it is feasible. In fact, as I understand it, it's even feasible to do it as a dollar-denominated system, because the dollar as an accounting unit is not really controlled by the U.S. government. But it would be much more likely to have it be euro-denominated or denominated in some basket of currencies.
Yeah.
But all of that is technically possible, although it would surely take some months to set up as a practical matter.
Yeah.
The political feasibility is the bigger question, insofar as this is a clear, explicit move against essentially the U.S. influence over and in this system. And it would very much depend upon how the Trump administration would respond. If they respond aggressively, they certainly would have any number of levers at their disposal to say, well, basically, we'll punish you for circumventing the intent of our sanctions, and they could do this in a number of ways, and then European leaders and European businesses would have to decide whether this is still worth it.
Yeah.
I think
Professor
ultimately
Yates.
this alternative system...
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Finally, very quickly, what kind of irony do you think it is there that European leaders are kind of standing up against the United States, which have been bossing them for a long time? But also, the Americans would say, we have been providing security for you for a long time. We have paid a lot more than you have paid in terms of proportion. So, of course, there are give and take. What do you say to that?
Well, the defense structure that the United States set up in Europe during the Cold War served the United States' interests. It also perhaps provided defense shield for Europe, but the United States has been placing its pawns in other regions of the world and concentrating its military expenditures in the Middle East and talking about moves in Asia. It's very likely that the United States was going to de-emphasize the defense of Europe at any rate, looking at the long picture, and that Europe was going to have to sort out its defense on its own. So if the Trump administration wants to mix the discussion of defense with the discussion of sanctions, it might actually be undermining itself, sawing off the branch it sits on, because the ultimate source of U.S. power in the world is not its military power, certainly not in Europe. It's the power of the United States dollar. And if it provokes the other major economies of the world to create a parallel system to dollar hegemony, all of that U.S. debt, trillions of dollars held overseas, can be called in, and it will lead to the collapse of American hegemony.
Okay, let's wait and see what happens in the long-term future. Many thanks to my two guests from New Jersey in the U.S., Professor Tim Buthe, Vice Dean and Chair of International Relations in the School of Governance at the Technical University of Munich, and in Paris, Professor Douglas Yates, Professor of Politics at the American Graduate School in Paris. You have been watching The Point. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, China's top ride-hailing application is under fire after a second passenger's murder. What's being done to keep passengers safe? Stay with me. Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi Chuxing has once again found itself at the center of controversy. Police said a driver raped and killed a female passenger last Friday in eastern China's city of Wenzhou. A similar tragedy already occurred in May when a female passenger was killed after using the service in another city. In response to this latest murder, Didi said the incident was too high a cost to pay and had shown the many deficiencies with our customer service processes. Now the company has suspended its hitch system for re-evaluation and also fired relevant managers. Meanwhile, Chinese Transport Ministry says the incidents have exposed loopholes of the platform and demanded Didi to stop making empty promises and take concrete steps to ensure passenger safety. So why didn't the first killing prevent the second from happening just 3 months later? What kind of responsibility should the company shoulder, and what can be done by the industry and the government to guarantee safety in the age of shared economy? In the studio, I'm pleased to be joined by Thomas Luo, co-founder and CEO of PingWest, and Yin Bo, Associate Professor at the College for Criminal Law Science at Beijing Normal University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Let's first give a little bit of cultural context to this news story. What is the hitchhike culture in China? I understand when I grew up, for instance, or when you grew up probably, we never had this hitch culture, right? This only came up a couple of years ago with the arrival of such application. So what is the Chinese people's mentality or attitude toward taking a hitch with somebody you never met?
Yeah, I think the hitch service, I think this kind of the hitch service in China is a really new thing. Just come up with the applications like Didi or the Uber China, this sort of things. But in US, I think the hitch is a really common culture for the mass people, because people just have this kind of habit even before the Uber started their business. I think so hitch in China is a new thing. So people just give some more expression on hitch service beyond just heading the people from one place to another place. And some people just think hitch is sort of like the social connection or social network service in China. I think that might be the one problem.
Yeah, so what does that cultural context say, or what's the implication for this case, Professor E, the fact that we are not very familiar with hitch culture? We probably, in my understanding, do not understand the risks that can come with riding a stranger's car.
I have a different idea about the hitch culture. I think it's not about the culture stuff. It's actually a kind of legal relationship. It actually, the Didi Chuxing provide a service of a brokerage, an agency to provide an approach for the customer to get access to the driver, and they share the routine and save the money, save the costs. I think that's the fundamental issue that we must resolve either in the United States or in China.
Okay, let's make it very clear. We are talking about one specific function within this car hailing service that's called hitch, which means you can ride the car of somebody who commutes regularly between A and B, and then if they have a shared itinerary, you can say, okay, can I ride your car? But this person can be anybody, right? And meanwhile, we have some other service where you can take a taxi, where you can go into a taxi with carpool, right? So there are various services. But exactly, what does these two murder cases taught us about the deficiencies of this platform?
Actually, the platform hasn't provided enough supervisory responsibility for this kind of relationship. Because initially, actually, the Didi hitch service is to provide a platform for you to share the itinerary and save costs. But gradually, because of the making profit reason, gradually this kind of platform actually caused a lot of risks, especially for the female passenger and the male driver.
Was there nothing done after the first case happened?
Actually, there are a lot of measures has already been provided. For example, the audio visual of a certain person, and also the SOS device to provide some risk. Also, the customer service provide urgent emergency.
Why did it not prevent the second girl from being harmed?
I think the initial relation, the legal relation, is to provide the platform rather than service rather than the taxi
Take
service.
responsibility too.
Yeah.
So what is the problem then, Thomas?
Yeah,
exactly what is the positioning of the service of whether it is a taxi service, whether it is a social platform, or what is the problem here?
So I have to say the current H service on Didi is far beyond the core concept of H service itself. Firstly, is that actually there's some of the, I have to say, there's some of the drivers who are using the H service are not using that to just like a hitch, and they just make it as a business. They just make this like what the Uber pool drivers normally do, and they just drive these cars and for money. So it's not a hitch. It's just like the Uber pool or like
as if they're providing a taxi service.
Taxi service, almost
illegally.
like that. Illegally, firstly, is that. The second is that it's still hitch service has a lot of the social functions on that.
So you can find a
you can
friend,
find the profile,
yeah,
and you can find the profile of the male or female, and his picture, his or her picture, age, or even jobs, or this sort of thing. So I think it just caused some kind of problem, because I don't think that people can use the hitch service as a social net service, because from the passengers, they never think we can make friends from that platform.
We just wanted a ride.
Yeah, we just need a ride.
A cheaper
Yeah,
ride.
exactly.
But again, my question is, after the first case was reported, why not nothing was done, or maybe insufficiently things were done to prevent the second case from happening?
I think perhaps this kind of platform bring forward to a certain risk. Naturally, it's just that unavoidable risk. But I mean, for the Didi Chuxing, the only choice is to not to eliminate, but to decrease the risk, to provide any supervisory function, monitoring function against those kind of potential risk.
But it seems that they didn't do enough, at least, because the netizens were extremely angry, right, after the second time.
Yeah, they did something.
They did something. For instance, they promised to improve the emergency help button, right, so that it's easier for anybody who find themselves at risk to call for help. But again, in the case of the second murder, the girl couldn't reach the police so easily, and even when the police called the Didi platform refused to disclose the information of that driver to the police in time to save the life of that girl. Why was this not done?
I think the problem is just in the company, and that might be the problem of the operation part, because just the call center is the part of the operation services in the company. I think in Didi is that firstly, and they once removed some of the functions, like for the driver you cannot see the passengers, male or female, or their pictures or this sort of things once, and they removed this kind of things. But after almost 3 months, and they just uploaded this sort of the functions again.
Why?
I just think they think these sort of things will never happen, or will reduce the frequency of this kind of the victims. I think that they guessed that. And the second thing is the operation. I think the call center, the call center workers in Didi platform, I think they don't take the granted and to have more power to make the decision to give the right response and to the drivers or their friends or their families. So I think they should get more power to do that, and they should just improve the quality of this kind of the call center supporters. I think it is a very important thing. I think the operation is a very crucial part of that, beyond of the product, even technology. I think operations is really important for that.
Another thing is Didi is really a monopoly of the situation, right?
Exactly.
Didi is the only application of such scale. Basically, everybody I know uses Didi, right? And I use it very frequently, me personally. Of course, although I never use this hitch service. Does that create problem? Does that mean that when you have no competition, it could be a problem?
Yeah, because I think the anti-monopoly law in China is not so complete, so sufficient to regulate this kind of issue. Because, for example, in the United States, we can not only use Uber, but we also use the Lyft. If I find that this Uber is not satisfactory to me, I can move to Lyft. But in China, the Didi and the Kuaidi merged together, and actually
and then merged Uber China.
Yeah, they merged.
So there is
Uber
only
China.
one big service providing service. What's the role of the Chinese government here? I mean, of course, they also have the responsibility because they didn't regulate or supervise such a platform in order to, provide a safer. What's going to happen next to such regulation? Will there be tighter regulation? Will there be some laws coming out? Will such application be banned, be kicked out of service? What will happen?
As you may know, in 2016, we actually have the online healing service regulation. But gradually, because this regulation hasn't provide guidance to the hitch service, but maybe in the future we can strengthen the total liability to the hitch service provider. But also, from my perspective, we can increase the criminal liability for that hasn't provided enough supervisory function.
Yeah, Thomas, what do you think will be the implication of this incident?
Yeah, I think in this kind of the regulations or the laws should be give more details and to be executed. Now, in this kind of regulations, it's just a guideline, cannot be executed. Even sometimes more.
Executed, you mean?
Yeah. Even sometimes more tightened and to provide the regular service. So I think this should be more practical and to the local governments to do the right things and with the platforms like Didi, the first thing. Second, I think the government it's not the right attitude to stop this kind of the hitch service or this sort of things, but they have the power and they have the right to let the service platform to
become more mature.
Become more mature, to take the responsibility of the security issues, and so that by taking the long view and to embrace, to encourage this kind of the service happen.
Okay, well, shared economy or car hailing is a new thing for us, I guess for many other countries in the world. So regulation
and risk.
Yeah, it's going to take some time. It's going to take some time for the regulations to improve itself. Many thanks to my two guests, Thomas Luo, co-founder and CEO of PingWest, and Yin Bo, associate professor at the College for Criminal Law Science at Beijing Normal University. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.